There is an interesting historical development that has to do with the Torah reading. If one looks in the Talmud, we see that when the Jews were exiled to Babylon after the destruction of the first temple, that their knowledge of Hebrew declined, and they were much better at understanding Aramaic. And so, whereas previously the reading of the Torah took place and people listened and understood, this was no longer happening, and the sages instituted that there will be a simultaneous translator by the Torah reading, the Maturgaman. Strangely enough, this custom does not exist today, and already the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, writes about how then people didn't know Hebrew well. Now we don't need this, and indeed the level of Jewish education improved greatly, and later generations understanding what is written in the 5 books of Moses was par for the course. Now, we still don't have that custom, although it can certainly be said that with the assimilation of the 20th century that the knowledge of Hebrew again declined. But what we have nowadays is we have great translations in different languages. So almost every country, when you go to the Kriyat Torah, you can get a Chumash in English or in French or in Spanish or in Russian. And that is how we bridge that language gap. But indeed, in the years of the Babylonian exile, the Talmudic period, it was customary that a man translates that which was being read from the Torah in Hebrew. Now, of course, whenever the Torah is read, it's read in its entirety. And apparently the richness and sanctity of the Hebrew language assures that somehow there will not be any misunderstandings. And once someone translates, so certain of that depth is lost, and one must settle upon a specific interpretation. As a matter of fact, I may have mentioned to it, there was a time when the date of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, was the subject of a fast day. And it was considered a sad day because the Torah could not be translated properly. And actually the Khatam Sofer explains that Hebrew contains all the different possible meanings. And even if one almost automatically interprets it on a certain level, he's aware of the multiplicity of symbolism and so on. Whereas when one translates, you must either translate the simple meaning or the homiletical meaning, but you can't do both. And therefore, this was the reason of this kind of sadness, not just because it was inadequate, the translation, but because it was precisely the ability to interpret the Torah on different levels, which testified to the very holiness and special quality, special godly quality of the Torah. So we find that the Maturgaman had instructions in the Talmud. It says there's certain sections which he should skip over. And one of them is in this week's Parsha, a really kind of a juicy story, it would seem, about Yehuda and Tamar. Now, if you're like most people, there's something you're supposed to skip over. That's what you read first. But although we don't have this custom anymore, it does have a kind of a residue in that when we teach small children who may not have been informed yet about all the facts of life. Nowadays it happens around 3, but in the olden days that wasn't the case. And in many religious communities, children aren't given that education at a very young age. And so it's easier to just skip over the story of Yehuda and Tamar rather than try to explain it to children. But, well, adults shouldn't have too much of a problem with it. It is a digression from the story of the selling of Joseph in the Parsha of Vayeshev. Yehuda goes off on his own to become a sheep herder. He marries a woman there, and he has 3 sons, and one is Er, one is Onan, and one is Shelah. And the first son marries a young lady named Tamar and dies, but it's explained there why he dies. It says he was evil in the eyes of Hashem. Onan, the second son, also died. And we see from context that apparently he did what the first son did, which is that rather impregnate his wife, that he spilled his seed. But Yehuda, the father, was not aware of this spiritual dimension. He just saw that Tamar married 2 of his sons. Now, why did he marry her to the second son? Although the Torah was not given yet, there was already a known tradition of the so-called Yibum, which is a levirate marriage wherein the name of the deceased brother is in some ways carried on through his brother marrying the widow and having children. Now Yehuda is afraid to marry Tamar to his third son, Shelah, and he explained to her that he's not yet old enough to get married, she should go back to her father's house. But what happened was that when he was old enough, Yehuda continued to not arrange this marriage, and Tamar caught on to that. And it's a very interesting story. Tamar, who does things in a rather non-standard way, she dresses as a prostitute and seduces Yehuda, asks for a guarantee, because before he says, "Let me come unto you," and she says, "What will you give me?" And he says he will send her some flocks, but for this she asks for a pledge. And he gives her a ring with his stamp on it, a special garment that he has, and his stick. He goes back. Then from other source, Yehuda is told, your daughter-in-law Tamar fornicated, and he even is pregnant. And as she's about to be condemned for this, Tamar says, "To whom belongs this ring and this garment and this stick? This is the man with whom I came pregnant." And Yehuda saw it, because he had searched for her but could not find her, and said, "Indeed, Tamar was right, because I refused to give my son Shelah." And this is what she did, because she prophetically realized that she had to give birth to the progeny of Yehuda. And she had 2 twins. One was called Peretz, and one was called Zerach. And Peretz is the ancestor of King David. And the commentaries go out of their way to say that these twins were righteous twins. Tamar is an extremely positive figure in Jewish tradition. The name is used. We name people after her. She had this special insight, although it was done in a rather unusual way, and was paving the path towards the kingdom of King David and the Messiah. All this is very, one level, quite messianic. Indeed, the Midrash says that as Yosef was being sold to Egypt, God was planning for the messianic era. This is not a coincidence, because, as is explained, the whole selling of Joseph to Egyptian slavery and everything that involved was in order for him to eventually become the advisor and vice king of Paro, and that at a later stage, when there would be a famine in the surrounding lands, all the other nations, including the tribes of Israel, would be forced to settle in Egypt, where they would prosper, but then later be enslaved, setting the scene for the slavery and then the exodus from Egypt, which is really what created our nation, and particularly following the exodus, the receiving of the Torah. And this is the state of redemption. When they entered Israel, a temple was built. Sadly, there were other exiles following that. But the first exile was Egypt. The first oppressor was Pharaoh. And the Midrash says that God, who gives the medicine before he imposes the illness, that before the first oppressor was born, he was setting the stage that the king of Israel, who would build the temple, should be born first. And that is why this whole scene with Tamar and Yehuda is told here.